Today I have 3 builds that are definitely a little strange, but somehow actually work. These builds might surprise you, because they definitely surprised me. Let's jump right into it. When I first put these builds together, I wanted to use exotics that aren't used that often, or used in ways that are different than how they are normally used. When I finished putting them together, I was pretty surprised at how well they worked, and honestly had a ton of fun using them. I will definitely be using these builds on a regular basis, but that's enough talk. Let's jump right into the first build, which will be the Warlock Build. So this build is an arc blinding build with the sole focus of blinding everything in sight, but it also has pretty good ability spam, which is pretty normal for arc, with all the arc traces that you'll be making. First, I'll start with the exotics, because that's where it gets a little different. The exotic armor I'll be using is the Chromatic Fire chest piece, which when you get final blows with the kinetic weapon, it creates an elemental explosion based off of your equipped super, and since we're using arc, that will be a blinding explosion. And of course, precision final blows grants the maximum explosion size. The kinetic weapon I chose to combo with Chromatic Fire is the Kvostov exotic, which every 7 bullets ricochets between enemies, which gets buffed when picking up an orb. I chose Kvostov because it's overall just a really good weapon, but also if the ricocheted shots kills an enemy, it will also proc the blinding explosion. What's cool about this build though is that you can pretty much use any kinetic weapon you want, as long as it's kinetic. Next, I'll hop into the abilities. For the super, I went with Chaos Reach for the extra damage output, but you can pretty much use either super. I think either one will work out just fine. I just think that Chaos Reach is the better pick overall, because we already will have pretty good ad clear, so the extra damage is nice to have. The rest of the abilities don't really matter all that much, but for the grenade, we will obviously be using the blinding grenade, for the obvious reason of blinding more targets. Next, I'll jump into the aspects and fragments. For the first aspect, I went with Ionic Sentry, which when getting arc or kinetic weapon kills, charges a sentry, which on deployment blinds targets, but it also chains lightning, which grants us bolt charge for the extra damage. The next aspect is entirely up to you, but I went with Electrostatic Mind, which defeating targets with arc abilities or against arc debuff targets will create an ionic trace, which on pickup makes you amplified. I went with this aspect just to create more ionic traces to have higher ability uptime, but like I said, it is mostly up to you. For the fragments, I went with Spark of Shock, which makes our grenades jolt, Spark of Ions, so when defeating jolted targets, or with Bolt Charge, it will create an ionic trace, Spark of Resistance, which being surrounded makes you more resistant to incoming damage, and Spark of Frequency, which getting a melee hit increases our reload speed and stability for a while, but it also grants more Bolt Charge stacks when amplified. Next, I'll quickly go over the artifact. For this build, I went with the Slayer Baron Apothecary Satchel artifact, and that is pretty much for one artifact perk, and that is Arc Compounding, which arc sources deal increased damage to blind targets. And of course, this build will be blinding absolutely everything, so it is just free bonus damage. The next artifact perk I went with is Kinetic Impacts and Weaken Clear, which is just buffing our grenade launcher, creating kinetic shockwaves, and weakening targets. Next artifact perk is Sentinel Burn, which rapid arc weapon precision hits consume an armor charge to trigger a blinding burst. Next we have Curative Orbs, which when breaking a target's shield, it creates an orb of power, and collecting an elemental pickup will give you a small amount of health. And of course, with how many ionic traces we'll be making, it helps with our survivability even more. The next artifact perk is Killing Breeze, which weapon final blows grant you a bonus to mobility, because why not? And last we have Trace Evidence, which rapid precision hits or rapid final blows on targets affected by jolt or blind will create even more ionic traces. And picking up ionic traces grants an armor charge, which is even more convenient. For stats, I try to shoot for max weapon stat to of course get higher weapon damage for the Kvostov, and second, I try and go for high grenade stat to get a ton of grenades out. I'll quickly throw the armor mods on screen if you'd like to pause and copy them. These mods mostly just give you more damage for the Kvostov and higher grenade uptime. The armor set I recommend is the Luminopotent armor set to get more traces on jolt kills. So with this build, you pretty much blind everything, which gives you even more damage against those targets because of the artifact perk. Blind is pretty good for survivability, because if nothing is shooting at you, you can't take damage. So it's pretty nice. But speaking of pretty good survivability, next we have the Hunter build. This build is a stasis hunter build that focuses on survivability and high weapon damage, and freezing everything. I'll first go over the exotics. For the exotic armor, I went with the Triton Vice exotic helmet, which gives you a whopping 100% damage bonus to your glaives when surrounded. It also overflows your glaive magazine with final blows, and projectiles have a detonating explosion, which works pretty well with the glaive weapon we're using, which is the Winter Bite exotic, which fires a ball that fires freezing projectiles. It also slows and deals more damage on hits when you have ammo in the magazine. With these two exotics, you have an insane combo that deals an insane amount of glaive damage, and it freezes everything. This is probably one of the tamer builds of the three, but still a combo I seriously never see. Next, I'll go over abilities, which will be quick because it doesn't really matter all that much. I really just use the Marksman Dodge with the shorter cooldown because it's important for the aspect we'll be using, but other than that, you can pretty much use whatever you want. Now I'll go over the aspects and fragments that I went with. The first aspect I went with is Grim Harvest, which when picking up stasis shards grants frost armor. While you have frost armor, stasis weapon final blows have a chance to shatter an enemy, which scales with your frost armor. Also, taking damage while you have frost armor grants class ability energy. The next aspect I went with is Winter Shroud, which dodging slows nearby targets, and slowing targets grants increased class ability regeneration for a short duration. The fragments I went with is Whisper of Fissures, which increases the damage of Shatter, Whisper of Refraction, which defeating slow to frozen targets grants class ability energy, Whisper of Torment, which grants grenade energy when taking damage, which scales with your frost armor, Whisper of Rime, which increases frost armor count and duration, and Whisper of Conduction, which allows shard tracking. With these aspects and fragments, you have really good survivability and a lot of class ability spam, which slows and freezes everything. Next, I'll go over the artifact. For this build, I also went with Slayer Baron Apothecary Satchel Artifact, mostly because it just has a ton of really good stasis artifact perks. For the first one, we went with Serve Cold, which picking up the stasis shard grants you class ability energy. Next, we have Brain Freeze, which freezing targets creates a slowing field, which is really good. Next, we have Hail of the Storm, shattering frozen targets and stasis crystals deal increased damage, and shattering stasis crystals release shards of ice that damage and slow targets. Next, we have Frost Renewal. While you have frost armor, taking critical damage releases a freezing burst, which is also pretty good. And of course, we've seen this one before, Curative Orbs, which when you break a target shield, it creates an orb of power, and collecting elemental pickups heals you, which of course we will be carrying a ton of stasis shards, so it heals us a ton. Next, we have Crystalline Converter. After activating your class ability, which we'll be having a ton in this build, your next stasis weapon final blow creates a stasis shard. Gathering stasis shards gives you more stacks of the converter, which causes your next powered stasis melee hit to create stasis crystals equal to the number of stacks you have. Next, we have Wind Chill, which rapid stasis weapon hits grants you stacks of frost armor. Hits against slowed or frozen targets also creates a stasis shard, which feeds into everything else. For stats, I went again with a max weapon stat to increase our glaive damage even further, and class ability second to spam our class ability often. I'll again show my armor mods quickly on the screen if you'd like to pause and copy. These mods are going to increase your glaive damage output and get your class ability back more often. For the armor set, I had a tough time finding one, and I didn't actually use one in the gameplay, but if I could recommend one to use, it would be the Swordmaster armor set. 2 exhaust targets on glaive hits, which reduces their outgoing damage. But I'm sure there are plenty of other really good armor set bonuses that you can choose from, so go crazy. So with all of that, you pretty much have a very aggressive build with really good survivability, with high frost armor uptime, and really good ad clear, being able to freeze and shatter everything. And of course, your glaive gets really high damage. You can almost kill a barrier champion every time without him even pulling up a barrier a single time. It is pretty dang good. Speaking of really aggressive builds, next we have Titan. Now before we jump into this build, I have to say I had a ton of fun using this build. It's a melee build you haven't really seen before, using something that isn't really ever seen, but will shock you at how well it can perform with the right setup. We'll start with the abilities this time. To start, we use Thunder Crash for the extra damage, but the interesting part about this build is that you'll be able to spam them pretty frequently, being able to get them about every 30 seconds because of our melee, which is the Ballistic Slam ability, which actually does a lot. It's a melee that after sprinting and being airborne, you activate your melee to slam to the ground, dealing damage to nearby targets. But you also gain super energy and stacks of bolt charge based on the number of targets hit by the slam. This will be the main focus of our build. For the grenade, I'm using the Flux Grenade because of an artifact perk which I will go over later. The class ability is up to you, but I like using Thruster because of its low cooldown. Next, I'll go over aspects and fragments. The first aspect I went with was Storm's Keep, which sounds strange since I'm not using a barricade, but after using Thruster, you get 6 stacks of Bolt Charge, which is not bad, and that number does increase with a fragment I will go over in a sec. The next obvious aspect I went with was Knockout, giving me extra melee damage and range after critically wounding a target. It also makes you amplify and heals when defeating targets with melee, which will be happening an insane amount. For fragments, we have Spark of Resistance, which gives you extra damage resistance when surrounded, Spark of Shock, so your grenades jolt, Spark of Frequency, which melee hits give you faster reload and stability for a bit, also of course giving you extra stacks of Bolt Charge when amplified. Last, we have Spark of Ions, which defeating a jolted target, or with Bolt Charge, it will create an ionic trace. With all of that, we are getting tons of Bolt Charge off and getting a really good amount of health and super energy with how many melee kills we'll be getting. I'm sure you're curious on how we'll be able to spam our slam so often, and I will answer that curiosity with the exotics that we'll be using. The exotic armor piece we'll be using is the Insurmountable Skullfort Helmet, which after getting an arc melee final blow, it will fully refund your melee, and it will start health regeneration. Also, if you don't manage to get a kill with it, it gives you some melee energy returned. With this helmet, you will be able to spam your Ballistic Slam over and over and over again, proccing Bolt Charge and giving you tons of super energy. It also will be jolting too, due to an artifact perk, which I will of course go over in a bit. And if you don't manage to get a kill, you can get your melee back quick with the Delicate Tomb Fusion Rifle, creating a ton of ionic traces to help get your slam back. We also have armor mods that help with that too, but I of course will be going over that later. Now I'll quickly go over the artifact and artifact perks. For this build, I went with the Encrypted Data Disk, mostly for one artifact perk, and that is Taser Tag, which arc-powered melee hits, jolts combatants, and deals further damage for a short duration. This is a really good artifact perk for this build. But of course, the other artifact perks are just as good. The next artifact perk we have is Sticker Shock, which is the reason why we are using the Arc Flux Grenade, which because we're using that, it deals more damage when you attach it to a combatant, and on final blows, it releases several micro missiles that seek nearby combatants. The next artifact perk is Blinding Jolts, which final blows on jolted combatants blinds nearby targets. The next artifact perk is Armorsmith. Breaking a combatant's shield temporarily grants you damage resistance and increases melee damage, just another source of increased melee damage. The next artifact perk is Dielectric, which defeating arc debuff targets grants Bolt Charge, and rapidly defeating arc debuff targets spawns an orb of power and heals a small portion of health. The next artifact perk we have is Fierce Proxemics, which finisher final blows grant grenade and melee energy, which we also have armor mods to help us with that. So pretty much when you get a finisher, it fully refunds your melee. The next artifact perk we have is Kinetic Synthesis, which sustain kinetic weapon damage, and rapid final blows have a chance to generate a unique ammo brick. Collecting this brick will grant ammo to equipped kinetic damage weapons and grants special and heavy ammo progress. For stats, I went with the max melee stat for more slam damage and focus super stat next for higher super uptime. I'll again throw the armor mods up on screen if you like to pause and copy them. These armor mods are mainly to get your melee back if you don't manage to get a kill using finishers and picking up orbs. For the armor set, I think the Willbreaker set could be pretty fun with all the throw explosions, but I use the Luminopotent set again for the extra ionic traces after defeating jolted targets, which isn't difficult because of our artifact perks. So with this build, you are very aggressive, and the more aggressive you are, the more rewarding it is, giving you tons of super energy. It also has a ton of healing with the Skullfort exotic and knockout aspect. Overall, if I had to choose a favorite, this probably would be my favorite. It is very fun. So that's pretty much it for all the builds. These are definitely stranger builds than I usually would put together, but I think these builds are honestly pretty fun, and I think you can have just as much fun on these builds as I did. If you're curious, here's the drip for each build, if you want some drip ideas. Of course, I will have the dim links in the description for your convenience, and if you have any weird builds you use, feel free to share them in the comments. I'm very curious and I always enjoy reading the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to like and subscribe. I don't really like asking, but it helps me out a ton, and I always appreciate it, more than you know. But with all that said, thank you so much for watching. I will see you later.